Imagine being lost in the woods as a child, abandoned by civilization, raised by nothing but the sound of the wilderness and your own desperate need to survive. Now imagine that same child, years later, being found by society and brought back into the human world. What would they sound like? What strange behaviors would they have developed? And most disturbing of all, what horrifying sounds would they make when trying to communicate? Today, we're diving into one of the most unsettling phenomena in human psychology, the terrifying vocalizations of feral children. These aren't your typical cases of kids who spent a few days lost in the forest. We're talking about children who spent years, sometimes decades, living completely separated from human contact, developing their own twisted forms of communication that sound more like nightmares than human speech. I've spent the last 3 months researching every documented case I could find, digging through psychiatric reports, audio recordings that most people will never hear, and interviewing experts who've worked directly with these children. What I discovered kept me awake for weeks. The sounds these children make aren't just unusual, they're genuinely terrifying, and they reveal something deeply disturbing about what happens to the human mind when it's stripped of all social contact during the most critical developmental years. But here's what's really going to mess with your head. Some of these vocalizations follow patterns that suggest these children weren't just making random noises. They were trying to communicate using systems so alien to normal human speech that they sound like they're speaking the language of something that was never meant to be human at all. We're going to explore 7 of the most documented and horrifying cases of feral children and their disturbing vocal patterns. Each one gets progressively more unsettling, and by the end, you'll understand why researchers who study these cases often refuse to work alone with the audio recordings. Trust me, once you hear what I'm about to describe, you'll never think about human development the same way again. The first case that really opened my eyes to how terrifying this phenomenon can be happened in 1970 in California. A 13-year-old girl was discovered after spending nearly her entire life locked in a room, completely isolated from human contact. When she was found, she couldn't speak, couldn't walk properly, and made sounds that the social workers described as inhuman. But it wasn't just that she couldn't talk. The noises she made were actively disturbing to anyone who heard them. The recordings from her early rehabilitation sessions reveal something that sounds like a cross between a wounded animal and something trying to mimic human speech, but failing in the most unsettling way possible. She would make these low, guttural sounds that would suddenly spike into high-pitched wails, almost like she was trying to scream but had forgotten how. The rhythm was completely wrong, not like crying or any normal human vocalization, but following some internal pattern that made no sense to anyone listening. What made it even more disturbing was that she seemed to be trying to communicate. She would look directly at people while making these sounds, pause as if waiting for a response, then continue with increasing urgency when no one understood. It was like watching someone speak a language from another planet, except this language was born from complete isolation and deprivation. The researchers noticed that her vocalizations followed certain rules. She had different sounds, for different emotional states, different patterns for different needs. But these patterns were so removed from normal human communication that they felt fundamentally wrong to hear. One researcher described it as listening to what humans might sound like if they had evolved completely separately from the rest of our species. But this was just the beginning. As they worked with her over months and years, they realized that her vocal patterns weren't random. They were sophisticated. She had developed an entire communication system based on sounds that would make your skin crawl. And she was frustrated that no one else understood her private language of isolation. The second case takes us to the forests of France, where in 1800, a boy was discovered living completely wild after spending years alone in the wilderness. The sounds he made when first captured weren't just unusual. They were described by witnesses as demonic and not of this world. But what's really disturbing is that these weren't just random animal-like noises. He had developed specific vocalizations for different situations, creating what researchers now believe was a complete communication system based on sounds that seemed designed to terrify rather than communicate. The boy would make these deep, resonant calls that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat. Witnesses described feeling physically uncomfortable when he vocalized, as if the sounds were triggering some primal fear response. But the most unsettling part was how he would layer different sounds on top of each other, creating these complex, harmonic patterns that sounded like multiple voices speaking at once, except all coming from one small child. When he was hungry, he would make these rhythmic clicking sounds with his tongue and teeth, but not like normal clicking. The rhythm was off. Too fast, too precise, almost mechanical. When he was afraid, he would produce these high-pitched whistling sounds that would suddenly drop into low groans, creating an auditory experience that made people want to leave the room immediately. What researchers found most disturbing was that he seemed to have developed these vocalizations as a form of echolocation. He would make certain sounds and then pause, listening to how they bounced off of objects around him. But the sounds he chose for this weren't the efficient clicks that bats or dolphins use. They were these haunting musical tones that seemed designed more to create atmosphere than to navigate. It was as if he had turned survival into something that sounded like a horror soundtrack. The third case brings us to Ukraine, where in the 1990s, a girl was discovered who had been living with a pack of dogs for several years. You might expect her to bark or howl like the dogs, but what she actually did was far more disturbing. She had somehow combined human vocal capabilities with canine communication patterns to create sounds that belonged to neither species. She would start with what sounded like normal dog whining, but then it would shift into these almost melodic patterns that dogs can't make, using the full range of human vocal cords. The result was this eerie singing whining hybrid that sounded like a dog trying to sing human lullabies, except the melodies were all wrong, following patterns that made listeners feel inexplicably anxious. But the most chilling aspect was how she would use these vocalizations to try to establish pack hierarchy with humans. She would approach people while making these sounds, getting progressively louder and more complex until the person either backed away or asserted dominance. The sounds weren't aggressive exactly. They were more like negotiations, but negotiations conducted in a language that felt fundamentally threatening to human ears. The researchers working with her noted that she seemed to understand that her vocalizations had a powerful effect on people, and she would use them strategically. If she wanted something, she would start with softer, more musical versions of her hybrid sounds. If she was denied, the sounds would become harsher, more discordant, almost like she was trying to use audio to make people uncomfortable enough to give her what she wanted. What made this case particularly disturbing was that her dog-human hybrid language seemed to be evolving. Over the months of observation, researchers noticed her sounds becoming more complex, more sophisticated, as if she was developing new ways to combine human and canine vocalizations. It was like watching the birth of an entirely new form of communication, except this new language sounded like something from a nightmare. These cases represent just the tip of the iceberg. As we dig deeper into the documented instances of feral children and their disturbing vocalizations, the patterns become even more unsettling. What we're looking at isn't just the absence of normal human development, it's the presence of something else entirely, something that emerges when the human mind is left to develop communication systems in complete isolation from its own species. The fourth case takes us into territory that even seasoned researchers struggle to discuss openly. In Romania, during the 1980s, authorities discovered a boy who had been living in complete isolation in an abandoned building for over 6 years. What made his vocalizations particularly horrifying wasn't just their alien quality, it was their precision and intentionality. This child had developed what can only be described as a mathematical approach to sound production. He would create these intricate vocal patterns that followed specific numerical sequences, almost like he was performing complex equations with his voice. The sounds themselves were deeply unsettling. Imagine someone trying to speak while simultaneously humming, clicking, and producing these wet, throaty noises that seemed to bubble up from somewhere inside his chest. But here's what kept the research team awake at night. His vocalizations seemed to predict things. He would produce certain sound sequences before rain, different patterns before sunrise, and specific combinations that occurred exactly 14 minutes before anyone entered his space. It was as if he had developed a vocal calendar system based on environmental patterns that normal humans couldn't even perceive. The recordings from his case reveal something that sounds like a human voice filtered through some kind of alien translator. He would speak in these rapid bursts of sound that contained elements of human speech, but arranged in ways that made no linguistic sense. Words would be broken apart and reassembled with mathematical precision, creating sentences that followed perfect rhythmic patterns but conveyed meaning through methods that bypassed normal language entirely. What made it even more disturbing was his reaction to normal human speech. When people spoke to him in Romanian, he would immediately begin producing these mirror image vocalizations, taking the sounds he heard and transforming them into his mathematical vocal system. It was like watching someone translate human language into something that had never been meant for human ears. The fifth case brings us to India, where in the early 2000s, 2 girls were discovered living with wolves. But unlike typical wolf children's stories, these girls had developed something that researchers initially thought might be a form of shared psychosis. They would vocalize together in perfect synchronization, creating these layered harmonies that sounded like a choir performing in a language that predated human civilization. When separated, each girl would continue trying to maintain her part of their vocal duet, creating these haunting half-conversations with an invisible partner. The sounds they made weren't just wolf-like. They were something entirely new, a fusion of human vocal capabilities with pack communication that had evolved into something resembling music, but music designed to communicate concepts that human language couldn't express. The recordings capture these extended vocal sessions where the girls would build complex soundscapes together. They would start with simple howls, then layer in clicking sounds made with their tongues, then add these rhythmic breathing patterns, and finally top it all off with these melodic lines that wove in and out of each other, like they were performing some ancient ritual that existed only in their shared isolation. What researchers found most disturbing was that their synchronized vocalizations seemed to serve as a form of joint consciousness. When one girl was injured, both would produce the same pain vocalizations. When one was hungry, both would engage in the same feeding sounds. It was as if they had developed a vocal system that allowed them to share experiences directly, bypassing individual consciousness entirely. The sixth case takes us to the absolute extreme of what human vocal cords can produce when guided by a mind that has never learned the boundaries of normal communication. In Siberia, a teenager was discovered who had survived alone in the wilderness for nearly a decade. The sounds he made weren't just disturbing, they were physically painful to listen to. He had somehow learned to use his vocal cords as a multi-instrument orchestra. He could produce 4 distinct tones simultaneously, creating these complex chord progressions that resonated through his entire body. But these weren't beautiful harmonies. They were discordant, unsettling combinations that seemed designed to trigger every possible fear response in human listeners. The most terrifying aspect of his vocalizations was their range. He could produce sounds so low they were felt more than heard, vibrations that would make people's teeth ache and their stomachs turn. Then, without warning, he would shift into frequencies so high they bordered on ultrasonic, sounds that would make dogs howl and cause immediate headaches in anyone nearby. But it wasn't random noise. There was structure to his vocal chaos. He had different signature combinations for different times of day, specific harmonic progressions for different weather patterns, and particular chord sequences that he would use when approaching different types of animals. He had essentially turned his voice into a survival tool that worked by manipulating the acoustic environment around him. The researchers studying his case noted that prolonged exposure to his vocalizations caused distinct psychological effects. People would report feeling anxious, disoriented, and sometimes nauseous after listening to his sounds for more than a few minutes. It was as if he had inadvertently discovered how to use human vocal cords as a form of psychological warfare. The seventh and final case represents the absolute pinnacle of what happens when human vocal development occurs in complete isolation from human society. This case is so disturbing that most of the research remains classified, and the few audio samples that have been released are heavily edited and limited to short segments. A child discovered in the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest had developed vocalizations that researchers describe as impossibly complex and fundamentally inhuman. The sounds this child produced seemed to tap into frequencies and patterns that normal human vocal cords shouldn't be able to create. But more than that, the vocalizations seemed to have effects on the environment itself. Animals would flee when this child vocalized. Plants would visibly react to certain sound patterns. Even electronic equipment would malfunction when exposed to specific vocal sequences. It was as if this child had developed a form of communication that interacted directly with the natural world in ways that bypassed normal sensory channels. The structure of these vocalizations defied every known principle of human language development. They contained recursive patterns that folded back on themselves, creating infinite loops of meaning that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Linguists studying the recordings reported feeling like they were analyzing a language that existed outside of time, with grammar rules that operated according to principles that human minds weren't designed to comprehend. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the child's apparent awareness of the effect these sounds had on others. There were clear indications that the vocalizations were intentional, strategic, designed to achieve specific outcomes in the listener's psychological state. It was as if complete isolation had allowed this child to discover aspects of human vocal potential that civilization had trained us to suppress. These 7 cases represent more than just unusual child development. They're windows into what human communication might look like if it evolved completely outside the constraints of human society. Each case shows us a different aspect of the terrifying potential that lies dormant in our vocal capabilities, waiting to emerge when normal social boundaries are removed. But the implications go far deeper than just understanding feral children. These cases suggest that human vocal communication as we know it might be just one limited expression of much more complex possibilities. The research into these feral children vocalizations has revealed something that challenges our fundamental understanding of human development. When we strip away all social conditioning, all learned language patterns, all cultural constraints on vocal expression, what emerges isn't silence or simple animal sounds. What emerges is something far more complex and infinitely more disturbing. Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the few researchers who has worked directly with multiple feral children cases, describes the experience as listening to humanity's shadow language. She explains that these children haven't simply failed to learn normal speech. They've actively developed alternative communication systems that tap into vocal capabilities most humans never even know they possess. The most unsettling discovery from her research is that these alternative vocal systems seem to be more efficient at conveying certain types of information than normal human language. The mathematical boy from Romania could communicate complex environmental data in seconds using his numerical sound sequences, data that would take paragraphs to explain in conventional speech. The synchronized girls from India could share emotional states and physical sensations instantly through their harmonic patterns, achieving a level of communication intimacy that normal language can barely approach. But efficiency isn't what makes these vocalizations so terrifying. What makes them genuinely disturbing is their apparent ability to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to something deeper in the human psyche. Every researcher who has worked with these cases reports the same phenomenon. Exposure to these sounds triggers responses that feel completely involuntary, as if the vocalizations are accessing parts of our nervous system that civilization has taught us to suppress. Dr. Chen's team conducted controlled experiments exposing volunteers to heavily filtered recordings of feral children vocalizations. Even with the sounds processed to remove their most extreme characteristics, subjects consistently reported feeling anxious, disoriented, and sometimes physically ill. Brain scans during these sessions showed activity in regions associated with fear response, but also in areas linked to language processing that are normally dormant in adult brains. These 7 cases force us to confront a terrifying truth about human potential, that beneath our civilized speech lies something far more complex and disturbing than we ever imagined. The next time you hear a child learning to talk, remember that they're not just acquiring language. They're being trained to suppress the alien communication systems that isolation might otherwise unlock. What other capabilities are we conditioning ourselves to forget?